town meeting.
Okay, does anybody second that we call the Finance Committee?
Second.
All in favor?
All in favor.
Liz, do you want to take?
Sure. So Marilyn and I have attorney Greg Corbo here with us tonight, and he is going to provide a brief presentation on some of the aspects of both an override and a debt exclusion. And then we thought we'd take a look at some numbers that we've been working with and then open it up if people have specific questions for Greg as far as any particulars are concerned. So I'll turn it over to Greg.
Great. Well, hi everyone. I've probably met all of you before, but if not, I'm Greg Corbo, Town Council. And yeah, I thought that I would start by giving an overview of, what is a debt exclusion, what is an override, what's the difference between the two, and what are the procedures for pursuing either or both of those paths. So to jump right in, as you all know, you have a limit as to the amount you could raise by taxation each year, which is called Proposition 2.5, and the maximum amount that you are allowed to raise by taxes is called the levy limit. And each year, your levy limit is allowed to go up 2.5% over the year before. However, there are a few mechanisms where the town can take advantage of opportunities to increase the levy. And for our purposes, the two that are in front of you are an override and or a debt exclusion. So an override is something where you raise your levy limit permanently for either a particular purpose or for general municipal purposes. So an override can be something along the lines of to fund the fiscal year 2026 operating budget. And if the override is approved, then your levy limit is increased by the amount of the override. And as long as you spend those funds in the first fiscal year, then that results in a permanent increase in your levy limit. And then each year's 2.5% increase starts there. That becomes your new baseline. The other mechanism is a debt exclusion, and this is something that is used for temporarily increasing the levy limit for the purpose of paying for a particular capital expenditure. So this could be for a capital project like the fire station project. It could even be for a purchase, like purchasing a new fire engine or a police car or something along those lines. The primary difference between an override and a debt exclusion is that the debt exclusion only stays on the tax rate until the debt is paid off. So, let's say you go out and, you borrow for 20 years to rebuild the fire station. So the levy limit will be increased by the amount of the principal and interest that you pay each year on that project. And then at the end of the 20 years, when the project is paid off, that additional amount goes away, and you go back down to your original Proposition 2.5 calculation. Right? So before I start to talk about procedures, does everybody sort of get the lay of the land there, and are there any questions about that part?
I do have a question.
Sure.
On the override, you must spend those funds during the fiscal year. Does that mean you just designate the expenditure of those funds? So, for instance, let's say in the year before you do an override, you have to use a fair amount of reserve fund in order to deal with certain expenditures. Is it an expenditure to put that money back in the reserve fund, or do you need to expend it and then use other funds as part of the balance to help fund your reserve?
Yeah, so, let's assume that you're going to do this for a general override to cover a budget shortfall. you'll raise and appropriate a certain amount of money, and then when you start to spend that money, the first part of that raise and appropriate comes out of the override. So, as long as you do that, then you will be fine. That will be considered spending the override and will get you through to the following years. And then in the following years, you can use that money for anything that you want. Other questions about the?
So, just so if you do an override, you don't have to levy to that maximum. You just have to at least raise, you don't have to raise and appropriate up to that new maximum. You just have to raise and appropriate at least how much the override was.
Well, no, just that first year, yes, you have to raise up to the new max.
Right. Oh, up to the new maximum.
Yes.
Right up to the top.
Yeah.
Levy limit.
Can you, I think this is what was the last one, but since your levy limit remains the same going forward?
So, right, so then if you do it, right? So I'm like pretty basic with math, but let's just say that your base number going into fiscal 26 is, a budget of $10 million, okay? So through Proposition 2.5, right, you would get an additional 2.5% on top of that. Let's say you get an override of 500,000 or half of it, right? Then that money gets added to the original amount and the 2.5, and that becomes your new base. So in the next year, fiscal 27, when you get your 2.5% increase, it gets added to that.
Yeah, right.
So I have a question, just because I'm not sure I understand this. Speaking with the DOR, they bring up a case because they say how important it is to report your overrides, and sometimes have not done that. And if an override is passed and it's not reported, you can't raise those extra funds. So then the next year, the town came back and they're like, well, wait a minute, we did an override last year. They said we never reported it. You never needed it last year. But they didn't say that override was then no good. They were able to raise the funds the following year, even though they didn't raise the funds the year.
Okay, so I'd have to look at that specific case,
Okay.
but, that's sort of the general rule, is
Okay.
that, in order for it to carry over into future years, you have to spend it.
You could basically take the override and use that as your raise and appropriate, and take the free cash and put that into reserve fund.
Exactly, yeah. Right, you can use,
You're kind of moving the belt
Yeah.
around to make sure that you spend what you need to spend, and then whatever's extra you use.
that's right, and you would use your other funding sources in the same way that you always use them. And, what the benefit of this is, obviously nobody wants to hear that their taxes are going up, but, you want to try to avoid using, one-time funding sources to fund on, continuing budgets, right? So, you don't really want to draw from stabilization to fund your budget shortfall, or the reserve fund, but those monies would still be there, and if you wanted to use stabilization to fund some of the capital projects, it would still be available to you to do that.
Would it help people if we looked at some of the numbers? So things changed even after I emailed some of the group members today. We got in our county pension assessment.
Can you just tell us what it is?
877, one sec, I can pull that up.
The only reason I asked is because I had received information it was going to be double digits, and I shared that information with Liz.
This is for the county
Is this
pension.
for Mayflower or not?
No, this is not Mayflower. So Mayflower, we're still hearing 15, and that's what most communities have programmed in. On our proposed budget, I have programmed in for Mayflower, it's only a 5%. That's because during the current fiscal year's budget, initially the treasurer had requested I believe it was 525,000, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to go back and look at that request. And then during the budget process, we weren't sure if things were going to change, so we added a little cushion to that. So that's actually helping us for going into fiscal '26. That for us, that's why this only says 5.2% as a placeholder and not 15. But we are being told that it's appearing like roughly a 15% increase. But I received the county pension number in today, and that's a 10% increase. So I had to edit our spreadsheet that some of us have been working from after I sent it out this morning. So in looking at some of these numbers in this little modeling scenario that we're running, if we take the new, and obviously this will not be the recommended fiscal '26 budget number. This is without going back to anybody for further trimming. But if we take everything as initially proposed, it puts us a little over 16 million. We have a very conservative number as a placeholder for ATM warrant articles. We also need to bear in mind that some of our free cash would be impacted managing the remainder of the deficit for this current fiscal year. So in looking at all these potential funding sources, I think what Greg was pointing out is that, say you went for, and I'm just going to say theoretically, a $2 million override, you would spend that first. You would raise and appropriate as part of approving the budget. And then some of these other funding sources that you see here, we wouldn't utilize those funds. So those would remain safely in those respective accounts and would not be utilized. And this here, so after putting in the county pension number, obviously this 7,343 under the max available, like we can't go forward like that. It's way too close to the maximum allowable. Originally we had more of a cushion, and then as numbers started coming in, it kept chipping away at that, unfortunately. And this was assuming like a really kind of far out there scenario, so to speak. Like I would never recommend that we utilize this much money from general stabilization. But it was just to kind of show what it would take to stay below that limit so that people could make an educated decision as far as moving forward with an override or not. Obviously, if the town is inclined to go in that direction, we have Greg to help guide us through that process and what it would look like timeline-wise. But I think that the public outreach portion of things to get people to be aware would need to start relatively soon. We would also need a calculation. I'm assuming that, Lisa, you work with the assessor's office. We'd have to be able to tell people how much per household they could expect to see in the way of an impact. We would just...
Would we be presenting two budgets at that point?
So Marilyn, Greg, and I actually had a chance to chat a little earlier today. That is one way of doing it, but I don't think that sounds like the best option. I think we'd be better off coming up with a realistic override number, having one budget prepared that assumes it will pass, and then if it fails, we'd have to schedule a special town meeting, likely by sometime in the fall. It has to be before the tax rate is approved, from my understanding. And then at that point, we'd have to go back and do more cuts, and we could also try to pursue it again, but maybe we reduce the number that is being requested. So we would have some options, but I think the two budget, honestly, I mean, that would be a tremendous amount of work. And I also, if there's a real need for it, for the override, I think that sends an odd message to the taxpayers. Like, oh, here are these two budget options. I think people would say, well, why aren't you just going with that one? And the answer would be because it's catastrophic cuts.
I do think we'd have to have, I don't think coming sense is going to be helpful, but I do think you have to have that active
Right.
because otherwise people aren't, you're not going to get it published.
Right.
Because it's, Dennett is, and we can, when we get to that point, we can go through where we are. The numbers, at least based on the meeting we had the other night, aren't quite as bad as it is because it didn't take out some money that we're receiving, so that helps. It's still not a good number, but it's better. But Dennett doesn't have much to cut.
Right. As we saw for this current fiscal year. We don't want to be in the same place.
So,
next year.
you know, it will be pretty catastrophic. That said, you know, I think if we had to go down that path, I think we're doing to let people know that we're talking about cuts in these places. And, you know,
Right.
Dennett would be stacked.
Right.
There isn't anything else to cut, and you're going to start getting the teachers.
Right.
And then I don't know how you manage the grades, because the school's 250 students right now, and they're predicting 260 for next year.
Is there a low class right now?
Not really. So all the last 20 and change and up, and some of them are 20, high 20s.
It's 30% higher than it was in 2020.
199 students in 2019, 250 and change right now. 260.
Numbers supposed to go up, too.
Yeah, I mean, but it's dartboard. I mean, nothing seems to be accurate as far as predicting it, so they have a placeholder.
Well, the thing that's definitely not dartboard is the needs of the students have increased statistically. The amount of high need students we've had from 25% to 35%, 260 or 251 this week. So the demands on the teachers are also increasing. The profile of students we're seeing influx.
But more of that fun later.
So Greg brought up an interesting point when we had a preliminary conversation, and that was about if the town does pursue an override, we do have to be cautious about who's presenting it and what's happening with that. So Greg, I don't know if you want to explain a little about that.
Sure. I mean, I can give a very general overview. I'll just sort of give a warning that this is a very complicated, even way more complicated than understanding what an override and exclusion is. And there's a lot of sort of like nuance to the facts, but generally speaking, there is a campaign finance law in Massachusetts, and the requirements of the State Ethics Commission limit the extent to which public funds can be used, or public resources can be used, to advocate for or against a ballot question, including an override or a debt exclusion. So, you know, there are certainly ways, you know, to talk about these things in public meetings and informational sessions, but, you know, you have to be sort of more careful. You can't mail flyers out to people saying, you know, why they should vote in favor of the override. You know, one of the, I think, more landmark cases on this, you can't put flyers in kids' backpacks in the school, you know, telling them, give this to your parents and have them vote for the override. So, you know.
I mean, the government can do that.
That's,
Anybody in the government is not.
that's right. And so, you know, in your personal capacity, you know, you can go out and you can say whatever you want and you can post things on Facebook, but, you know, you can't use your official title. You can't say that you're doing it as a member of the school committee or the finance committee or select board. It just is, you know, this is my personal opinion on why we need an override or an exclusion. If you do prepare, you know, written materials or make presentations, they sort of need to be factual. Like, if we don't have an override, this is how it impacts our budget. Just don't then go on and say, therefore you should vote yes. But if you, and when you prepare those materials, you know, you can have them available for people to take at the end of the meeting or a public information session, as long as there are enough copies for everyone. You can put a link to it on your website, as long as people have the option of clicking on that link or not clicking on it. What you can't do is like a targeted mailing, a reverse 911, anything that is sort of like involuntarily received by someone.
Organizations like parent teachers or the athletics that aren't
Yep.
funded by the town, those can.
Yes, as long as they do not represent themselves as being the town, then they can do whatever they want. And as long as they're using private funds, right? Now, let's just say that someone who works in the town hall is on one of those committees. They can't offer to use the town hall copier to print out flyers, right? They have to go to Staples or whatever to do that work, So, again, it's tricky, and, when we get to that point, I can certainly work with you guys on, if you say, we want to do this, I can tell you whether or not it's within the parameters, and if it's not, I can kind of direct you in the way to go. But I think it is important for everyone to just sort of be aware that these limitations are potentially out there.
You can do an FAQ, for instance, that just lays out the facts. But this is why an override is being proposed. This is what approximate cost for X amount of assessment would be, so on and so forth. You just can't say, so make sure you vote on the 24th.
I wouldn't say make sure you vote.
Right. That's, you can't say you can't go.
That's right.
You stop at the factual information.
That's right.
So here's all the information about it. We're not telling you which way to go. We want to make sure, because one of our biggest mailings that we have is, of course, sending out the town warrant. And everybody gets it. And that would be a place to put the factual information, full stop, and say, so that way, everybody got it. And it's not like who's on Facebook on this page or who's there, because there's a lot of information that doesn't seem to make it really around.
Who's paying for the mailing?
Well, so again, there's a very sort of
Factual, it's not a promotion of it.
there's a fine line here, right? Because these rules don't apply to town meeting, right? So anyone can say anything they want about town meeting, right? So if you have your town meeting warrant and you put a note like a selectman's note or a town administrator's note or the finance committee's note, you can say something along the lines of, this budget is being presented on the assumption that, a Proposition 2.5 override is going to be approved at the ballot. Voters should understand that if that override question does not pass, that budget will not be balanced, and cuts will need to be made, and we'll have to come back at a subsequent town meeting. The discussion, would all sort of focus on town meeting, the school's asking for X amount of dollars. Why can't they be asking for Y amount of dollars? The police department wants to buy a new cruiser. Why do they need a new cruiser this year? Right, so these are all things that are sort of, related to the budget and related to spending money that don't go to the question of, or at least directly to the question of whether or not you should vote for the ballot question.
Is that a similar process as the debt exclusion? Do you need the Board of Selectmen to request that ballot question?
Yeah. So you want to talk about procedures?
Yes.
Because they do differ a little bit. So both for an override and a debt exclusion, there are two parts. There's an appropriation at town meeting, and there is a question on the ballot for the election about whether or not to exclude that appropriation from Proposition 2.5. It doesn't matter which order they go in, and you can repeat the steps additional times during the course of the fiscal year if one or the other is not successful. So the most common way of doing this is to start with town meeting. So in the context of a debt exclusion, you would have a town meeting warrant article that looks just like any other raise and appropriate or funding article. So let's say it's for the fire station, right? The funding source for the new fire station would be to borrow $100 million to construct a new fire station, subject to passage of a debt exclusion at the election. Okay? So in that circumstance, right, the town will have authorized you to borrow money, so it takes a 2/3 vote. But the vote doesn't take effect unless the override passes at the ballot. So at that point, then, it's up to the select board to put the question on the ballot. They have to do so by a 2/3 vote, which does not affect you because you only have 3 anyways. But so the select board puts the question on the ballot, and then the voters at the election vote on the question the same way they vote for town officers. And if the exclusion is approved by a majority of the voters at the election, then you have the debt exclusion. And so the prior appropriation at town meeting takes effect, and you can borrow those funds, and those funds get excluded from your levy limit, and most towns would have sort of a separate line item on the budget that kind of shows, like, fire station excluded debt. And, when you put this question together, right, the question for a debt exclusion does not contain the amount of the exclusion, because you don't actually know what that amount is at this point. It just has to be enough amount to cover the principal and interest on the loan. And now, let's say that you go through this process and the appropriation passes at town meeting, but the debt exclusion fails at the ballot. And you get some feedback from people, and it's decided that, or you figure that, well, people wouldn't agree to $100 million for a new fire station, but they would probably agree to 75. So you can do these steps again. As long as they're done before your tax rate is set, you can have another town meeting, or just have another debt exclusion vote. And, if the outcome is different, great, you got to do it again. Likewise, if the exclusion passes at the ballot but doesn't pass the town meeting, you get to do that again as well. Obviously you have to be strategic about that, and, whether you want to take that chance or just wait, but the option's there. Now, with respect to the override, the process operates a little bit differently.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
It's voted at a town meeting, it fails. You have to have another town meeting, or can you just have another ballot question?
Well, so here's the practicality of it, right? Your town meeting and your election are separated by a week, right? So the question is going to be on the ballot regardless of what happens at town meeting, because you can't take it off once it's on there. So you might go to town meeting and not have it approved, but then next week it gets approved at the ballot. You can then have a special town meeting and try again to get it approved.
Conversely, though, it's voted at town meeting. It's turned down at the election.
Right.
You cannot then just have another election. You have to go back to town meeting to reauthorize it.
Oh, no. So
No.
you can, yes, if it fails, you can do the election just again. I think the reason why you'd want to do another, just 1 second, John, why you'd want to do another town meeting is that if you're going to change the number, the only way to change that number is at town meeting for a debt exclusion. Right, because at the ballot, you're not voting a number, you're only voting to exclude the debt.
If it passed the town meeting, they'll get to that. Could you let it go for a year or more before and just go to another ballot? Or do you have to then have that?
So if you don't do it in the same fiscal year, You have to start the process all over again with a new
It's not,
town.
is it fiscal year or is it before the tax rate is set? Because our fiscal year ends June 30th, which is like a month after the election, but our tax rate isn't usually set until November.
I think it's fiscal year though, but the fiscal year doesn't start till July 1.
Right, and so,
Right, so,
So like all of this is for fiscal '26 that we're talking about.
Okay.
Is it all in the fiscal year, or is it based on the tax rate?
before the tax
it's,
rate.
so if you do it at an annual meeting, the election has to be completed, I think it's September 30th. There's a chart in here. The election has to be held by September 15th for appropriations made at the annual town meeting or within 90 days after dissolving a session. So if you vote the appropriation at the annual town meeting and then it fails at the election, you can have another election before September 15th. And according to like the Proposition 2.5 rules, you could have 100 more elections, but the problem is that there are all these timelines for ballot questions, 64 days for this and 35 days for that. So practically speaking, you wouldn't get more than one other shot at it.
And the other piece that's one needs to think about is that we're going to have a bigger hand. So most likely, if it doesn't pass, both at the town meeting and at the ballot,
This is the exclusion.
yeah, that exclusion, then we would be started. Because the bid is likely not going to still be good. Obviously, the bid is going to be contingent upon both of these things happening. And so maybe it would be, but you'd have to talk to the bidder and see if they're willing to.
While it's there, the option is there to go back, the practicalities of it are very not likely. I mean, it'd have to be like, why? Like if people weren't in support of it in May, why would they be supportive of it in September unless you've done something different in the interim?
And I think it would probably give people probably with bad taste in their mouths if you say, oh, we didn't like the outcome that time, let's try again.
That's right. And I can tell you from experience, don't get your hopes up if it passes a town meeting, because in my experience, they are much more likely to pass a town meeting where people have to identify themselves as voting one way or another, especially for a debt exclusion, which it requires a 2/3 vote. But then anonymously at the ballot, it's a whole different ballgame.
So that's for debt exclusion. You said it's a little different for an override?
So it's a little bit different, but not terribly different. So again, you still need an appropriation at town meeting, and you still need the approval of the question at the election. The difference is that when you do an override at the election, now the voters are voting to raise a specific amount of money in addition to your levy limit for whatever purpose you specify. Now, you could specify to fund a deficit in the general budget. It could be, to fund a deficit in the regional school district budget, or, to fund, the hiring of 3 new police officers, So it could be very broad, it could be very specific, but it needs a proper public purpose, and it needs an amount stated. Now, when you go to town meeting, right, if we're talking about a general budget override, there are different options that you can pursue with respect to how you're voting on the budget, and Liz alluded to this a little while ago. So, option 1 would be you present your budget to town meeting based on the assumption that the override will pass. And if the override then does not pass, well, your budget won't be balanced because you can't raise enough money by taxation. And so you have to go back to town meeting in the fall or whenever and make cuts. And, you'll have to decide, make those painful decisions as to, which budgets are going to be cut by how much. Conversely, you can be pessimistic and pass your budget at town meeting on the assumption that the ballot question is going to fail. And then if you're pleasantly surprised and it passes, now your town meeting in the fall is much more positive because now you're increasing budgets because the override has passed. The other third option here that some towns use is they vote both budgets. They vote an override budget and a non-override budget. And sometimes they do it in one article with two columns, column A and column B, and column B being contingent on passage of the override. Sometimes they do it in two warrant articles. Say, this is the budget with the override, this is the budget without the override. So, you kind of have to be a little bit strategic about how you want to present this, how you think the voters are going to react, what your willingness is to have a second town meeting. I don't think you guys usually do, but, that's something, you would have to be accepting of if you're going to go down that road. And then, as I said before, if the override is passed, that then becomes a permanent increase in your levy limit, and that becomes your new base and you build from there. And in those future years, you're not, even if you do an override, let's say, to purchase 3 new police cruisers, in the following year, you still have that money and you can use it for whatever you want. You're not limited to only using it for police cruisers forever. So that's the big picture. I think you guys have the much more difficult work of figuring out, what do we want to do? Do we want to make those cuts now? Do we want to postpone this project? Do we want to try to get an override and the debt exclusion in the same year? These are all difficult questions, and to be frank, you don't have a ton of time because there is going to have to be a lot of public outreach to get people to understand. Even if you're not advocating, people need to understand, right? You're all have experience in this, but and it's hard to understand. Imagine if you had no experience at all. And you start getting these terms thrown at you like levy limit, and Proposition 2.5, and override, and debt exclusion. Your mind is going to go numb, and you're just going to vote no. So it does take a fair amount of outreach. All the departments kind of have to, work together. If departments sort of start playing off of each other, and it's not going to work. You really need everyone to kind of, dig in and
Can I
say.
ask a question too?
Yeah.
When you said, as far as this is going back to who can advertise us and apply it, could organizations like, say, the Firefighters Association, can they say if they were in favor or against it? Well, the police department can't, police chief can't, but in those organizations?
So yeah, and so, and again, this is a hard topic that is very fact specific, so I don't want to, say yes, this thing is okay, and no, that thing is not. Like, for example, there are some circumstances in which the police chief can speak to it as it's within the scope of his responsibilities, as opposed to a police officer who doesn't have any responsibilities with respect to the budget. But if you have a private group, they can do whatever they want as long as they are using their own resources and they do not represent themselves as speaking on behalf of the town. They can also say, I want to book this room to give a presentation as to why the override should pass. And as long as the group on the other side gets to book the room to say why the override should fail, that's fine. okay? But again, it's like, you know, the firefighter who is a part of this organization, you know, can't be making copies while they're on duty, or using, you know, the firehouse copy machine, or making calls, you know, from the fire station, or, you know, asking people while they're in uniform questions or making statements, you know. So it's complicated, but not impossible.
Okay.
So I can see a lot of blank faces. I did send to Liz and Marilyn the Department of Revenue guidance that has the sample votes in it. I think it's a pretty easy read. I think most of you will think so as well. So take a look at that, and then, you know, as you start to put together, you know, your budget and your warrant and election warrant, I can, you know, follow up with you and, you know, give you additional guidance. But, you know, I think these are some, you know, at least this is a good overview for you to kind of understand what your next steps are, and really just sort of talk, you know, big picture, you know, how do we want to proceed for this year?
Well, I think we need to do something,
Yes.
because if we only have a $7,000, possibly $7,000, under the levy limit, it's not
And that's
gonna
using
work.
800.
Yeah, that's using-
stabilization.
Yeah, we don't want to do that anymore. We can avoid that. It's just not very smart. It's not physically sound.
Do you want to talk about the assumptions of the schools? Because I know we're big numbers, and maybe we can give some color to your assumptions of whether or not they're valid at this point.
Let's do that. I think that would be helpful.
So, on the spreadsheet for the town, what did you use for an increase for the town? We want to start with the town.
I use the full one. Looks like I have to reconnect here, but we had the full amount, and then for the Silver Lake assessment, I got it up to like 12.9% increase, but I didn't know.
Okay. Did you use 13.6 on it?
Oh, okay, I don't think I got it quite that high.
Version 1 budget.
But what would that be in dollars from Silver Lake?
3.575 from Silver Lake.
So let's start with that, because that's more known. At the meeting that we were at, we were presented with a $783,000 increase. Right off the bat, we noticed in the presentation, they hadn't done the reduction already for circuit breaker. Right? So the number that we were presented with that showed that close to 20% increase was already misrepresented to a certain extent. I don't think it was on purpose or malicious, but we were able to knock $108,000 off of that number right away just by looking at it.
And then they had a lower circuit breaker percentage too.
Yeah, and they were using a safe circuit breaker number. Circuit breaker is governed by the state of Massachusetts. It's reimbursement for extraordinary special ed costs. And I believe their assumption was 60 or 62%. But House 1 had already come out, and the governor put into House 1 75%, which is the maximum allowed to statute. And we haven't had below 75% since Karen Spilka has been the president of the Senate. So we can rest on the fact that circuit breaker will be at about 75%. And once we started asking that question, the 240 grant came into play. The 240 grant is the federal circuit breaker, IDEA. And once we started talking some numbers, it was pretty quick that we got that overall increase to about $600,000 before we made any cuts or any further adjustments to the budget.
Okay, I got it up on the screen finally.
So we probably, I think we're about 200 off from 240 and circuit breaker. Again, this is all preliminary, but
Right.
just to sort of
We needed 600,000 just for that.
So that requested amount should be changed?
Well, I wouldn't change anything yet. We have a meeting at the end of February where they're supposed to come back with some additional numbers. And so one of the other things that they did in order to, be cautious is that put in for 3 vote tuition positions. We have 1 student going to vote. We already told them that 3 was too many. Maybe we'll have a conversation about vote positions. And so likely, and of course, we won't know till April 1st. They have till April 1st to do it, but likely we would suggest budgeting reform. Understanding that come April 1st, if someone else decides they want to go to the Yankee, we're going to have to add that back in. That's another 60. So, but once we get past that, there probably isn't too much to trim off. The other thing that we asked them to figure out is that with circuit breaker funds, the thing is, remember, these are reimbursements. And so we made the change with Silver Lake last year. And so, every pre-K and 7 to 22 went to Silver Lake. But we got reimbursed for those last year at the debt because we had them the year before. So Silver Lake didn't get any reimbursement for these new expenses that they had, which is why there was part of why there was a big jump in Silver Lake. We now have, what, 438,000, almost 440,000 in additional special ed expenses, net new this year, that should we pay those out, we would be eligible for reimbursement next year. So what I want to understand, and again, this is estimates, and we can't walk into anything, but how much, assuming that we don't have any other surprises with the Senate budget, which is assuming a lot in the last 3 years, but let's just pretend we're in a happy world and there's no other changes, how much could we expect in an increased reimbursement off of that number? So in other words, we have a $440,000 increase. Is that going to be still a $440,000 net increase in the budget next year, or will some of that come back in reimbursement? And we ask for that to do a rough calculation there, so that we have an understanding of what would happen with the budget.
Say next year, you're talking fiscal 26.
No, we're trying to also project what might happen in 27 for the town to understand.
So I'm a little confused about what, if anything, happens in 26.
In 26, I think our number's closer to 600,000 than 783
And perhaps lower.
perhaps lower. For a level service budget.
And one thing that doesn't include is that we're still down 1.4 FTE for aides, and that's having a significant impact on the school. And so we need to think about that, because what we run into, the issue that we have, is that those aides help the students that have, these additional needs. And if we can't help them in the school, then they go out of the school. If they're out of the school, it costs a lot more money.
And this budget's assuming there's position on the
Those are not filled at this point. Should we also talk about the projected overrun? So if we share that number with the overrun. So, recall the last time we met, we were talking about override or a need for additional funds to make the budget whole this year. With the 50,000 we took out of the special ed reserve fund, with some excess circuit breaker, with some tuition reimbursement and essential excess of 240 grant, they have that down to just under 50,000. So it's not 220,000 at this point. But I think they felt pretty good about that.
I think they felt good about that number. I think the budget freeze and the severity of the budget freeze is making things interesting at the Senate, but they wanted to do everything they could to not lose personnel. So Silver Lake is more nebulous at this point because we're waiting on one of the key factors of revenue that we have. Don't forget, regional schools are sort of like a municipality onto their own. And we have something called the E&D Fund, which stands for Excess and Deficiency Fund, that has to get certified by the Department of Revenue every year. We're allowed to hold 5% of our operating budget in E&D. And some of you may recall, I made a motion last year to use $750,000 to help offset the assessment to the towns. Now, the budget for Silver Lake has grown to $40 million this year, which means E&D could max out at $2 million. There was a meeting literally today with the Department of Revenue, and the number has not been certified. There needed to be some checks on that. I'm hoping this is because we have excess funds above the $2 million for E&D, which means I drained it almost all the way down to $300,000 last year, so it got replenished, hopefully. I'm very, very hopeful that it might be in excess of $2 million. As such, anything above $2 million automatically goes back to the towns as an offset on the assessments. And then I would motion as a single school committee member, and I can't guarantee that this would work, to draw E&D all the way back to $1 million total funding, to leave $750,000 for a capital plan and $250,000 as a reserve in case we run into a mid-year issue. It's like a lot like free cash for us.
There's a question, that E&D, that's like our free cash.
Exactly.
And so you're saying that the FY '24 hasn't been approved yet, that meeting hasn't been approved? The excess?
I think it's the FY '24's total. It's not approved.
But they must have numbers they're working.
There's numbers we're working
I know
with.
we're working with free cash. Like
But
we have this
I know that
DNR.
they literally had a meeting today and there was some revisions that needed to be made. So I don't know how substantially that can move the number. You would know that better than I would. Would you suspect it could move the number substantially? Or more of a rounding issue?
Well, no, it could be more substantial. Yeah, normally the school has, their numbers come out to 1, the DOR comes out to 1, and they say, why doesn't yours match what ours says it is? Because I've dealt with that myself at the town level. And then they have to try and do some calculations to figure out where they want to certify.
So Silver Lake's initial budget came out at $45,200,000, let's just say $250,000. They were assuming $2.5 million for circuit breaker, but that again is before House 1 came out with the governor saying it's going to be 75%. So right there, you could kick up circuit breaker to about 3.1 million, which could get us to $42,119,783. So that's about a $2 million, $2.5 million increase. That could be addressed by a couple $1 million from E&D, and we could be looking at assessments for Silver Lake being just about $40,000 or $50,000 instead of $550,000. And the other aspect of that is the 240 grant should now be applicable to Silver Lake since they've been special ed students for an entire year. Just back of the napkin calculations, that could be another $300,000 in federal funds through IDEA for Silver Lake as well. So depending on how E&D comes out, depending on the circuit breaker number, and depending on the 240 grant, there is a chance we could potentially get the assessment for Silver Lake to a net zero increase over last year. Now, we would have the rebound effect if E&D didn't replenish itself. So I have some big questions to ask. If we did have a big number, how is that possible? Is it something that we can replicate year after year? And if so, I wouldn't hesitate to draw that down and try and make the assessment as close to zero for the towns as possible. So that would be a game changer, about $550,000 less than we would probably anticipate for Silver Lake. This is a lot of ifs. And I don't even know if I'm going to have that E&D number certified in time for my meeting on Thursday night when I'm supposed to get the assessments from the 3 communities.
And that's for the entire Silver Lake district?
Yes, right. Yep.
So where does that E&D number come from?
So
Just like free cash,
Yeah.
it's the same
Yeah,
thing.
right.
The excess money that the schools had, depending
we do have some revenue
how much they
sources. The biggest one is we have a power purchase agreement, but that usually brings in a year 300, 400,000. Typical year about 200,000. So I don't know how my E&D would have gotten replenished to the point that we might be returning funds to the town. I have a lot of questions to ask, obviously. but if the money's there, I intend to use it. If we're asking towns to reach into stabilization, free cash, I want to make sure that Silver Lakes is depleted as well before we look anywhere else for that money.
As far as for the school folks, finance committee, and board of selectmen, do we think it makes sense to reconvene maybe on the 24th of February and expect to leave the room with a plan at that time? I mean, I don't think we have a ton of time, but I hate to see us investing in the possibility of proposing an override if some of these other levers can be pulled. And we can also circle back with some of the town departments. The bottom line number on the budget is without me circling back. Some I've already gone back to and they've cut, but we got another departmental, a board request came in today. It was a very late budget submission, and they're looking to almost double their budget. So obviously there are some things that can still be done on the town side that we can go back and have people sharpen their pencils and come up with some more realistic numbers as well. But I feel like at the very least by the 24th of February, I would think that if we do meet again, we need to leave with a plan and implement the plan.
Our next school committee meeting is the 24th.
Okay.
So we won't have additional information until after that meeting as far as Plympton and better information.
I wonder
But what
if
if we move that meeting to 5?
We have negotiations. You guys have negotiations.
what if we tried to do the Wednesday?
And then I think the other thing is we should start focusing in on warrant articles,
Yeah.
because at least we haven't, we're not done meeting with all the town directors, people like the ones in town, but I'm not foreseeing anything big there. I don't think we haven't touched on our consulting fund this year, so there's no need to punish that. I think we should be pushing on that.
I have a really conservative placeholder in for warrant articles, and I more or less sent something out to everybody saying, if you don't absolutely need it, please don't ask for it, kind of thing. And we have been fortunate with some different things we've had kind of offset by some different earmarks and that sort of thing. We're in good shape too on the police department's vehicle fund. That seems like it can fund at least one lease payment for the next year, so that's working as intended. That's the fees that they take in when they bring cruisers
Right
to
about
details.
$24,000.
Yeah, so they can definitely absorb at least one lease payment in there. So I think we're in kind of okay shape on articles right now. The highway department was hoping for $250 this year for roadways. Normally it was always $200. Then I think last year we had them cut that back. I believe it was $175. I'd have to go back and look at what we did last year for them. But they were looking for $250.
They're just going to be $111,000, chapter 90.
Right, that's with the chapter 90 to,
Right, but I mean, that was over and above what we thought was coming in.
it was. I'm just letting everybody know what was requested.
I
So,
have a question on, if we turn this, if these things happen, you're saying, Jeff Spagans, what will change in terms of staff?
If things don't change, like if my numbers from Silver Lake end up panning out and I don't have the excess and deficiency to hit. So the superintendent supplied 3 tiers of cuts. The first one's nominal, $150,000 in supplies. Tier 2 is about $650,000, and that would be the elimination of all high school athletics and extracurricular activities, suspension of late buses, and the safety supervisor get rid of data coaches and the athletic trainer. So Silver Lake would effectively have 0 after-school activities for our students. And then tier 3 is $1.5 million, and this is where we get into RIFs. 4 teachers, 3 aides, 16 more teachers, and 2 administrators, which would obviously incur for us some unemployment costs as well. So we had to cut deeper than we actually needed to financially to offset the unemployment insurance we'd be forced to pay. So
We contractually, we can't do anything about the administrators. I mean, 2 versus 16 seems to be on ratio.
So I don't know if you recall, but last year at the meetings, I asked the administrative team to take zeros. And they were asking for the deep and dramatic cuts to classroom teachers' positions. And as far as I know, it wasn't accepted. During COVID, we did the same thing.
And the 3 towns had recourse.
The 3 towns did have recourse. We only oversee one administrator or school committee members. We oversee the superintendent of schools. We have no purview over the building principals, the special ed director and the assistant superintendent. We get a courtesy approval of the appointment of the superintendent.
So in other words, they give the money and they make the decision around.
They do. They have, to a certain extent, line item of autonomy.
Thank you.
And at the Dennett, if we had cut, we will very, very quickly be into staff that directly impacts on the building and the students. And I'm not trying to say this to bang on or anything, but they're understaffed right now. And if we cut more aides, the aides aren't going to save that much, and it's not making a huge amount of money. You would start with, well, if the classroom teachers have an aide, then we're going to pretty much have our aides. And then your next thing is teachers, teaching staff.
How the aides spend making grades too.
Well, that's the greater issue, is that, you know, you have one student going to a collaborative, 60 65 plus transportation. So you're 75. I mean, that's adding back, that 75 is 3 aides. And then that's if the student goes to the collaborative. So, you know, we haven't over time added staff in special ed, in building special ed, and that has paid dividends. You know, they are overly busy right now, but they're hanging on. And without that, we probably would have multiple students out. So that's the problem. We did that as run no lead. So there isn't too much room to. I mean, like you can't trim that deficit out of that.
Let's schedule a meeting after you have some more information.
Yeah, hopefully I will on Thursday. I'm hoping the OR and my business director have sorted this out on Thursday. And hopefully it's excellent news. And we're all hoping desperately for excellent.
This is probably the bigger one.
It's the biggest level we have.
Ours,
All
we
3
know
bills.
it's not 783, and we know it's lower, but it's not going to be 150.
And don't forget though, if this lever manifests and we can put $2 million from E&D towards the assessments to the towns, we still have to contemplate, will it replenish at the same amount next year? And that will put us behind the 8 ball next year if it doesn't.
And that's,
Again,
But it will give us 12
that's using
months.
one-time money to pay
Yeah,
operational
But
expenses.
it will also give us 12 months to look ahead and plan more strategically of how to proceed instead of being stuck in a situation where we find ourselves now, where we only have a few months.
and
Can they tell you where they underspent?
That, I intend to ask those questions. I have a laundry list of questions to ask.
Want to see
26,
about the 27th?
26,
Oh,
27
26th, I'm sorry,
26th
26th, the Wednesday.
is Wednesday.
Would that be Monday, Wednesday, or meet twice?
Moving it to
Moving it.
Wednesday.
How would that work for
That works
you?
great for
That works
us.
for you? everybody? No, it doesn't work for you?
But I wouldn't be here Monday either, so you lose me.
Oh,
No, I won't be here Monday. I doubt. I'll be coming back from Maine, so.
What time, Madam Chair?
5:30? Does that work? Does that work for everyone?
It's going to be 6.
That's at the same time.
5:30, yeah.
And I can give a real quick update about the fire station. We did pre-qual, and so that's where everyone has to go and pre-submit information, so they're qualifying about the bid. We had 13 general contractors sending information. Dan is happy, Dan's not happy about it. He's happy. That doesn't mean that we won't get higher bids, and with everything else running around with tariffs, my steel's now going to cost more. But he's hopeful.
Still in the morning.
He's hopeful. So we will have a number. I think he said by mid-April we will have the bid. So we will actually know what some of the building station will. And that will allow us to be able to go to want to educate townsfolk and also to be able to go to town meeting and be able to explain to people this is what we get. It's not going to be the issue where we're going in with gas and then go to bid. And ask Pembroke how that's working out. We're getting 40% over what they appropriated. And that will be what it is. Obviously, we still need to have some more discussions about how we pay for that, what items we can look at. We have debt exclusion drawn off. So that doesn't mean, that means that's going to drop in the tax rates and drag it back. It helps to offset it. We have some potential debt dropping off in Silver Lake, which all helps. It's still going to cost. Maybe we can use some capital, but we're still going to have the debt exclusion and still be a decent number.
Would you kind of stick in the back of your mind the alleged 25% increase for steel and aluminum?
Well, it's not in the back of our minds. It will be in the bid.
Okay.
I mean, that's the benefit of going this route. We will have the number.
You'll have the number, you're going to have the number. What I'm saying is that these potential tariffs
Yeah.
will come and go. So will you have two numbers?
No, that's the
Oh, that
contract.
doesn't make sense.
Contractor has to put the bid in, and the contractor will have to.
So they will stick to it.
Yeah, we don't have a ton of steel in the station. It's mostly going to be a wood frame building. I did ask Dan about the tariffs. He said, I don't worry about it. He just doesn't think it's going to be a huge issue, but it may impact some of the bidders. It also depends how hungry they are and what they need for a board. The fact that 13, a year ago they probably would have had 3. So
it's not going to affect MDF?
when we have a bid, the cost of materials is not our problem. It's the contractor's problem. So we'll have that information by mid-April. We obviously will need to have this probably follow-up finance discussion about how we think everything fits together, and then we'll need to work on an average cost and stuff like that. But that is good news. We're continuing the work that's being done on the septic field design. The well work is continuing. One of the mega well, 109 gallons per minute, that is all been tested and flowed, and the tests are off with getting all the test work done. The other 2 wells, we have a 1.3 gallon per minute well and a 9 gallon per minute well, both have a collapse in them. The question is, the hypothesis is that it have something to do with earthquakes.
May?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, so we're getting a quote right now to come back out and get back down and sleep past where they have, it's not fully caved in, but partially caved in. We can't test them until we do that. So we're getting that, and at least for now, all of that funding is coming out of the ARPA funds. Yeah. So everything's moving along, and when they get the testing back from the first well, they can start doing the design for the water treatment, and then also the design of how to move everything down. A lot of digging.
John, you may not know yet, but what ability, when the contractor submits the bid that will have to the station, what ability do they have to raise price as materials across their increase? Or what mechanism do they have?
I'm not sure they will for this type of job, because there isn't extra money. But we'll see how that comes out in contracts and all of that.
I'm sure they have contingencies.
They built it into their,
Yeah.
yeah, and they're building in contingency, which makes me think they'll build in a bigger contingency unless they're building. But again, for what we have in the station and how it's designed, Dan believes that it's not going to be particularly impacted, given what we're using and how we're using it. But none of that matters until we get the bids. It's all conjecture until someone gets a number to it. So our hope is it will be less than what has been estimated. And the estimator that we are using is pretty conservative.
Is there anything else? Is there a motion to adjourn?